Hey everyone, Mr. Happy here, and welcome to a video series that is honestly long overdue for my channel. Now, as many of you probably know, I've played a lot of Final Fantasy games a lot of times, and yet I don't really have any good definitive reviews of each of them. I've done videos like I briefly covered them for my ranking video on each game, as well as perhaps when the Pixel remasters first came out, at least the first 3 of them, but I don't have anything that's just here's how I feel about X Final Fantasy game and why. So I figured with 2023 it was about time I finally did that. Not to mention that I hope this acts as a resource for anyone who follows my channel and is looking to get into other games in the Final Fantasy franchise. Heck, maybe dive into the franchise for the first time altogether. So with that, we should probably start our first video in the series with the game that started it all. So everyone, welcome to Final Fantasy. Just a bit of history first. The original game released back in 1987 on the Famicom system in Japan, and it would take 3 years before it would come internationally to the Nintendo Entertainment System here in the US. Now, there's a lot of stories that go around about why it's even called Final Fantasy in the first place. The most popular one is that it was the last chance for the creator, Hironobu Sakaguchi, to actually make it in the game industry, and that Square was probably going to be in financial straits if the game didn't do well. Now, there is some truth to that, but it's not actually the whole truth. You see, originally, they just wanted to make something that was easy to pronounce in Japanese with the abbreviation, so they really wanted to go with FF no matter what, meaning they had fantasy, but what was the first letter going to be? Well, originally it was going to be Fighting Fantasy, but that was going to run into trademark issues because there was a book series of the same name that was already out or had come out earlier in the 80s, so instead they went with the word Final. Now that Final is the thing that people really talk about, especially because several years ago, the composer for the original game and much of the earlier section of the franchise, Nobuo Uematsu, he had said those things. He had been like, listen, if Sakaguchi was unsuccessful here, he was going to leave the game industry and go back to school, and Square would have probably fallen into bankruptcy. However, Sakaguchi himself says that really he just wanted the alliteration to go with that FF that they had originally planned, and while Final was somewhat inspired by the things that Uematsu said, he would have been okay with any word that began with F. They just kind of landed on the word Final. However, the game was a massive success, and well, we have the franchise we have today. No bankruptcy for Square, at least not yet. Now, it's funny because they were originally not going to make any sort of RPG. It was deemed to be something that wouldn't be seen as a commercial success, and it wasn't until the release of Dragon Quest and its commercial success by the publisher Enix that they would eventually allow Sakaguchi to do this, despite the fact he had been asking, like, please let me make an RPG for a game console. That's all I want to do. Basically, what I'm saying is, if you do decide to pick the game up and play it, just know that you are playing a pretty important part of JRPG history and Square history as a whole, way before they were Square Enix, which now they get to be brother and sister games with Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. But because of its history, it's a great thing to explore, and honestly, a pretty good game to boot. It doesn't break any boundaries. It is a late 80s/early 90s RPG for the Nintendo Entertainment System and Famicom, but it's pretty good all around, and let's cover why. So now on to actually talking about Final Fantasy I as a game. Final Fantasy I is a turn-based RPG where you'll go around the world and you'll defeat monsters and power up, all while you complete quests and save the world. It's pretty cliche, but you know, Final Fantasy does have its little specific things that would kind of carry the franchise going forward. You have to protect the 4 crystals of light, you are the legendary warriors of light, and you have to restore balance to the world. You know, a bit more than that happens, to say the least, but for the early days, it's a simple and fun premise just to get you moving through the story. It doesn't really require you to stop and watch a bunch of cutscenes and read a bunch of text. It just kind of makes sense. Nothing groundbreaking, but okay for a late 80s RPG. Now, at the start of the game, you'll actually be given the choice to name your 4 Warriors of Light and also pick their jobs. Now, each of your Warriors of Light can be any of the 6 jobs. You can even do all 4 of the same one if you want, and each of the different jobs has their own perks and attacks The big thing is, once you start the game, you are locked into those choices for the entirety of the game, so make sure you like what you've picked. A brief overview: the fighter or warrior is a powerful physical attacker with high defense. The thief is an agile and fragile DPS that's capable of fleeing more easily. The monk or black belt has high health and physical power in exchange for lower defense. The white mage focuses on support and healing magics, the black mage on debilitating and offensive magics, and the red mage is an all-arounder. It has decent physical attack, defense, and access to some white and black magic. Red mage and warrior were always my kind of reliable favorites, but monk is my number one across this and the rest of the franchise. Now, these jobs are actually given the opportunity to advance to a more powerful version later in the game. That usually gives them better stats per level, and in some cases even magic. Thief becoming ninja, for example, gives them access to some low tier black magic, though in my opinion that was never really much a reason to pick them. You really need to like them right out the gate as far as I'm concerned. But because the choice is permanent, it can actually be fun replaying the game over and over again just to explore the different job combinations. Maybe some make one part of the game easier and another part harder, and maybe some you just find to be completely OP. I actually did a 4 white mage run not too long ago, and it went a lot smoother than I thought it was going to go. I just had to prepare especially for certain circumstances. It helps that the game is realistically 10 to 15 hours. It depends on the version you're playing, and some of them have bonus content that will make you play way longer than that. But just to play through the story, it's a pretty good length if you want to play through multiple times with those different job combinations. Now, as you explore the world to complete your quest, you'll find treasures and dispatch of numerous foes, as I stated earlier. Now, when an enemy encounter begins, you are taken from the map screen to the battle screen, and you'll be given a chance to choose the attacks for each of your party members. Once chosen, the turn will play out based on the agility of each teammate versus your opponent's agility. Now, there is a kind of random modification to it that kind of makes it random all the same, given how volatile that actual random value is, but at the same time, it very rarely affects the overall outcome of the fight itself. These random encounters, especially in the early game though, can be quite scary, so stock up on tons of items and upgrades for your weapons and armor, because you're going to want to be as strong as possible at each new section of the game. When you stop at a new town, check all the shops. You may be a little distressed to see how expensive things can get early on, and you may be tempted to grind out a bunch of monsters. And that can be a bit disheartening, especially because it happens, again, kind of early in the game. That being said, the effort to kill a few of the local enemies, find something that drops a lot of money, or even to just power through is all up to you. You know, I like to get really strong, and even when I stop to grind, the game is still only 10 to 15 hours, so it's not really that bad. Just know that there's a lot of encounters, so always be prepared for more encounters than you expect to have. Seriously, that encounter rate does not mess around. Each different version, it's better or worse. In fact, I find the original NES version probably has the lowest encounter rate of all of them, but maybe that's just anecdotal. But some of them you can take one step and you will get another encounter, and some of them you will just rue the day that that happens. So be very, very careful. Now, I do want to briefly touch upon the magic system. The physical attackers are really straightforward. Press attack, hit enemy, good, you win. However, for the magic users, it may be a little bit unfamiliar for people who are used to more modern RPGs. You see, it used a more Dungeons and Dragons style magic charge system. Basically, instead of having MP or mana points, you get a number of casts that belong to a certain level of spell, and using any spell within that level would expend a charge. So, for example, you might be able to cast 3 level 1 spells and 1 level 2 spell. But in the later levels, once you've gained some experience, you might be able to cast 9 level 1 spells and 6 level 2s and 6 level 3s and 3 level 4s, etc, etc. But once you use all the charges in a level of magic, then you need to go back to an inn, or in some versions of the game use an ether, in order to recharge that and use the spells again, regardless of which ones you have available. Now, there are some versions of Final Fantasy 1 that do use a traditional MP system, and that's nice because it's familiar to everybody, but either way, it's just know how much magic you can actually cast at any given point and be prepared when you leave town. There's also ethers in some versions of the game, so you can get some MP back, and that can be very handy to have on, well, hand. Now, there are some other fun little tidbits that I'd be remiss not to mention before the end of the video. For one, a big thing with the earlier versions of Final Fantasy 1 is Church. Now, in most Final Fantasy games, if you've played them before, you might be used to using an item such as a Phoenix Down or maybe the Life or a Revive magic spell in order to resurrect KO'd allies. But in Final Fantasy I, if a member of your party was KO'd or killed, you had to take them back to town and take them to church to pay the church to resurrect them. Now, by the time the Game Boy Advance version came around, they did start having Phoenix Downs in the game, but if you decide to play one of the earlier versions, just know you better make sure those party members don't get knocked out in the middle of a dungeon, or you're gonna have a bad time, especially in the early portions of the game. Most versions of the game do have a few other notable things that longtime Final Fantasy fans may tell you about if you ask them a thing or two. The big one is the Peninsula of Power. Now, as you're traversing towards the second town, if you veer off the path and up towards a peninsula to the northeast, there are a couple of squares there, or tiles as they should be called, that actually spawn enemies that are way higher level than what's supposed to be in the area. It's basically grabbing the monsters from the little landmass to the north of you. Now, with proper play, you can actually kill these monsters super early on and get a huge boost of experience points, but of course, that runs the risk of you getting knocked out and having to walk to town to fix all of that. And it's not like the enemies in the area that you are traveling to are really that much weaker. They can still really knock you out if you go a little bit underprepared. But the Peninsula of Power is a classic Final Fantasy I thing that any longtime vet of the series will tell you to go try. Unfortunately, it is not present in the Pixel Remaster version of the game, so if you are picking that one up this spring or already have it on Steam or mobile, then you're just not going to be able to do that. Another really popular location for power leveling is over in the Cavern of Earth. Now, if you accidentally veer to the left after you enter the Cavern of Earth, it's a dead-end hallway that just kind of loops back around to the entrance, but you'll notice that every single step is an encounter against a few Gigas. Now, these are worth a ton of experience and gil, and thus, again, veteran players will stop and actually do this portion of the game. However, again, in the Pixel Remaster, it functions a little bit differently. Instead of trap tiles, the Pixel Remaster actually has trap monsters that appear, so you can actually choose when you want to engage in battle. This just means that instead of every step being Hill Gigas, you have to walk up to these monsters, leave the area, and come back, which does take a little bit longer, but it's still effective even if not as effective as the earlier versions. Now for the final bit to talk about here, and that is the different versions. Whole video I've been saying in some versions this and some versions that. Yeah, Final Fantasy I's been around for a while, so it's been remade and re-released a ton of times. The original NES version is actually pretty good even to this day, but it does have a lot more bugs than most of the other versions have. For example, the intelligence stat in Final Fantasy I on the NES or the Famicom doesn't work. So black mages, they suffer a little bit from basically having the useless stat that's supposed to actually amp their magic up. Not to mention there's these things called ineffective hits, where basically if you go to attack a target and it dies before you initiate the attack, it won't automatically retarget to another enemy. So you need to be a little careful about selecting which enemies you're actually attacking. Other than that, the NES version is just a little bit slow. It has to load a lot of text, and it usually has a few seconds between each text box and every stat it needs to tell you about, and every EXP and every level up, so sometimes it can get a little bit bogged down because of those things. It's no PlayStation 1 load times, but in some ways that's a lot worse. Speaking of the PlayStation 1, if you have your PlayStation around still and can get your hands on Final Fantasy Origins, that version's not too bad. It does have those longer load times, the menus take a second longer, the things you'd expect from a disc-era Final Fantasy game, but still not that bad. Looks a lot better, sounds a lot better, and plays perfectly fine. However, it's all the versions after that that most people will recommend to you when it comes to Final Fantasy I. So the big versions are the Dawn of Souls version for the Game Boy Advance and the 20th anniversary version for the PSP. Now, the Dawn of Souls version has tons of new items, it has a bestiary, freely able to save anywhere, the Soul of Chaos bonus dungeons, and an actual MP system. Yeah, it doesn't use that MP charge or mana charge system from the earlier games. The 20th anniversary version is very, very similar, except it's for the PSP, and it even has another bonus dungeon, though, not gonna lie, not a big fan of the 20th anniversary bonus dungeon, but I'll leave that decision to you. And then finally, you have the most accessible version, the Pixel Remaster. All these other versions, you'll need the GBA, PSP, PlayStation 1, NES. the availability is not good for those versions. However, the Pixel Remaster is going to be at least a little bit more available than most. Right now it's available on Steam, but it will soon be available on the Nintendo Switch and PlayStation, so that's a pretty good place to start. As for the actual content, the Pixel Remaster is really just an updated version of the original game. It doesn't have any of the bonus content that the Game Boy Advance or PSP versions have, and reverts back to that charge system from Magic. But it does have a ton of other quality of life that still make it a relatively better experience than the original Final Fantasy I. It's a great option for those simply looking to buy whatever you can get access to and try out Final Fantasy I. Overall, I love Final Fantasy I. It doesn't do anything phenomenally like some of the later titles, like my favorite ones, but everything at its core is just good. Not to mention you can see so much of the inspiration that would later, well, inspire the other titles, and that can be a lot of fun. Don't let the encounter rate scare you or any of the other things I've mentioned here. If you are a fan of RPGs or you want to try out a turn-based RPG because you're not too familiar with them, you really can't go wrong with Final Fantasy I. Even if it's not the best, it's still good. And that's going to be a wrap for my review of Final Fantasy I. Be sure to like, favorite, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned because we're going to be doing a dedicated video for every numbered Final Fantasy, and then we'll probably even hop on to the non-numbered ones after that. Oh boy, that means I know which one is next. Oh, it's okay. We'll get through it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, take care.